Hi there, I'm Hec, and what you're about to watch here is a video tutorial on my workflow for sculpting short hair and fur. I've sculpted a couple of animals before, and mostly for 3D print projects, including a gorilla, a cat, a couple of monkeys, and what you're gonna see here is the workflow for sculpting short fur on a jaguar. So it begins with the basic jaguar with no fur. Most of the muscles and the basic structure is taken care of. The pose is already also done. And I started with the ear. And in the ear I started masking basically sections where I thought the fur would not happen. And then I started blocking out some of the rough shapes of the clumps with the clay buildup brush. Here I'm using the Damien standard brush, and I'm using it on its outward version of the carving that it does. So it's pretty straightforward to see what I'm starting with. And while this is playing, I would like to just say some of the things that I have in mind while I'm sculpting the fur this way. And there are three things that basically, when it comes to fur, I try to always keep in mind. And one is the root, where the fur or the hair begins. And the next thing is the direction on which the fur is flowing. If it's straight fur or hair, I make, of course, very straight strokes. Short ones also, if the fur is short. And depending again on the length and on the flow and direction of the fur is basically how the strokes are gonna happen. And the last thing in relation to fur and hair that I keep in mind is, of course, the endings of the hair, or the clumps of hair. And when dealing with fur and with hair, both in animals or for example on the scalp of a human character, it's basically these same principles still apply. The roots, direction, length, and the endings. So I'm always keeping all these things in mind as I'm trying to block out fur and hair. So here I'm working on the chest, and I'm starting to mask sections that I'm going to push out as clumps. And I mask the sections, then I invert the selection. And once I have a mask of what I'm after, I use the move brush to basically push out the clumps and move them to overlap the section of fur that might be happening underneath them. And yeah, so for example, in the chest of this jaguar here, the chest fur is a bit longer and thicker, more fluffy than in the rest of the animal. And I looked at references of a few jaguars and also a few other different kinds of large cats. Of course, different large cats have different lengths of fur on their overall coat. And of course, different lengths of fur on different sections of them. Some of them are kind of similar, but they do differ between each other. For example, tigers have a lot more long fur coming out of the sides of their heads that give their head a bit of a wider appearance. Then, of course, lions have their mane, which is really long and big, fluffy clumps of fur. And in the case of these jaguar here, I tried to just give the chest a little bit more thickness on the fur. And some of this is also based on a bit of reference and things that I looked at when I was trying to find a look for the fur. I experimented with a lot of things, and I also bought, for example, some toys and some figures that were of animals that had short fur and slightly longer fur. However, a lot of these they're traditionally done, and mostly it's with a thin instrument and it's just a lot of raking, a lot of lines that create the fur effect. And from the distance, that can look good. Up close, I'm not always convinced with how that looks. So here I'm still kind of blocking out a lot of fur in different sections. I did a little bit on the chin, and while I do this, I've done several animals by now, and I've done a few different lengths of fur on them. With this one, I was trying to find a good balance of having unique patches of fur that is a little bit more fluffy, a little bit longer, and at the same time the rest of the coat is going to be very thin and subtle, so it's not going to be long fur. And I was trying to find a good effect for that. Before getting to that point, I was basically working on the chest here. And the technique is again, it's not that complicated. It's basically a matter of defining the clumps with the clay buildup brush, then masking some of them and pushing them out and pushing them forward with the move brushes, and then overlapping and moving them on top of each other a little bit, so that you get this sort of layers feel to it, so that it's kind of layers and clumps of fur of a certain length that are overlapping each other. Then all of this gets refined further with different brushes. In this case, it's mostly Damien brush, and in some cases I even use a standard brush here and there. This is all at the moment is just Damien brush, just defining again further where a clump ends. So I'm using the Damien brush a lot to define the ending of a clump or a section of fur. And I use the Damien brush in both directions, so in its inward carving direction, and also in its outward sharp outward edge convex direction. As I get towards the edge of where the fur is starting to transition into being less thick, I do a lot of just, again, more manual defining of fur with the Damien brush, and I start kind of being a bit more sparse with how much of the fur. So it's a transition basically from thicker and fluffier fur into the normal thin fur that the rest of the coat is going to consist of. And yeah, so the chest was basically one of the parts where a lot of time went into just defining a look for the thicker, fluffier fur. There are a few other sections of the animal that have this slightly thicker, fluffier fur, and some of that happens, for example, on the hinges and on the articulations of the legs and between the torso and the legs, and also on what is the elbows and knees of comparable anatomy on the animals. So at the joint sections, I try to kind of define a little bit of clumpy fur. And at this point, I'm also just experimenting all over the body on how to clump the fur a little bit here and there. And but most of the thicker fur is happening on the chest and on the connection between the legs and the torso, and in the elbows and knee sections of the animal. So here I'm doing a little bit on the paws and on the joints of the legs. But it's mostly just, a lot of this is going to be overwritten later by the general fur stamp that I'm going to be using. Here I'm using again the same approach, just blocking out a bit of volume, a bit of clumps with the clay buildup brush. Then once a bit of that buildup is constructed, I will basically be refining and exaggerating some of that. It's not going to be exactly the same as what I did on the chest, but it's similarly thicker and fluffier fur that is slightly longer. A lot of this fur that I'm doing, for example, on the backside of the animal, a lot of this fur ends up being overwritten by what I do later with the fur stamp that I created. But on these sections, especially on the underbelly, also I ended up doing a lot of custom fur similar to what I did on the chest, and so yeah, here I'm still doing the same approach, and I do this all the time. Also, when I'm working in different figures or different characters and projects. I run all over the place and try not to over finish anything, so that if I work on something for a while and then I can leave it alone and return to it, I can basically see how it's going, how it's looking in relation to the rest of the body or the piece. And here I'm also trying to figure out the way that the fur is flowing on the paws, and so here I'm returning again to the neck to try to work on those transitions between thicker, longer fur and the rest of the coat, which has a pretty even length of fur. And yeah, so a lot of the same. So maybe some of this video will end up a little bit boring, but hopefully it also helps to explain my thinking and the process. And this is just the way that I'm stylizing the fur. I've looked at the sculpted fur on a lot of physical bronze sculptures and a lot of traditional sculptures out there. Also some other ZBrush sculptures, and I was impressed with some versions of what I've seen out there, but I wasn't completely sold with every version that I found. So I actually found some really good bronze sculptures that had really nicely defined fur, specifically on felines. So I used some of those bronze sculptures as some of my main references, and I tried to get a similar look, but also still just kind of try to find my own way of approaching the fur, and a look that I was happy with. And so this was attempting to be an evolution of how I sculpted the fur on the gorilla for this same project. And so here I've done the same technique again. After defining a bit of clumps with the clay buildup, I went into the areas, and with some masking I started pushing out some sections of fur, pulling them out and then overlapping them a little bit under the clumps that are next to them. And here is just more Damien brush. I'm using the Damien brush often when I'm sculpting this fur, and I'm also using the Orb Cracks brush sometimes. The Orb Cracks brush is a really good brush for this kind of defined cuts. Here I'm starting to fade between different steps, because this whole process, I recorded a lot more of it, and some of it is edited out, because otherwise it would have been a really long video. This already is a pretty long video. But here, this fur is actually being defined more with the Orb Cracks brush than with the Damien brush. So some parts of the fur I defined and refined with the Orb Cracks, and some are with the Damien brush. With the Damien brush, I toned down the intensity. It's by default it's at 30, I believe, and I toned it down to around 20, 19, something like that. So it just gives me a little bit more control, and yeah, it's, of course this can be controlled with tablet pen pressure. But yeah, this is basically all just hand refining and hand sculpting a lot of these clumps of fur. And this was of course done for a miniature, but it was a personal project miniature that I was sculpting. So I spent a lot of time just kind of experimenting with the look and the definition of the fur. And a lot of this is not necessarily something I would do for for a miniature that is that has a tight deadline, I would probably figure out slightly faster ways of approaching some of this, more effective. But since this was for a personal project, I was a little more experimental and gave myself a bit more leeway to really spend a lot of time on something that might not even print that sharply anyways, because this was for a 75mm miniature, so it's not a large piece that is going to have the fur completely printing out and looking sharp as possible. But yeah, a lot of this again is just defining this longer patches, longer fluffier patches of fur that happen on the underbelly and in the intersection between the legs and that underbelly. A lot of felines have a very plushy belly to them. My own cats, for example, have really plushy fur on their underbelly. So I think a lot of cats tend to have that. And so yeah, here that's basically what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make that slightly longer fur. So yeah, I do basically that kind of look on those sections on both sides. Since the figure is already in pose, I'm not doing the same on both sides. All four sides were basically uniquely sculpted. Now we're jumping into basically what is the process of me making the fur stamp that I ended up using across the whole body. So this fur stamp is sculpted in a very similar way to how I sculpted the fur on the chest. I'm basically masking clumps of fur, and once I've done the masking for these clumps of fur, I start pushing them out. And I'm doing this on a plane, on a 3D flat plane. So I'm sculpting all of these patches of fur, and I'm not giving them too much length, because this is gonna be what I'm gonna use as a stamp for what is gonna be the shorter general coat of fur that is gonna be across the whole animal. So I'm trying to find a look of short fur that is gonna be usable on the whole animal. And so yeah, this becomes kind of similar to how traditional sculptors end up using, for example, stencils or brushes and all the kinds of tools that basically allow them to cover large areas with a certain texture. Some traditional sculptors, of course, sculpt a lot of the fur just with individual strokes, or a few strokes of a textured brush or instrument. So once I'm done with a bit of the main pass of the fur, I'm pushing out some of the tips, and here I'm using the snake hook brush to push out some of the tips. And again, this keeps in mind that same principle that I mentioned in the beginning, is beginning, length, and flow, the direction of the fur, and the ends of the fur or the fur clumps. So the parts that I'm pushing out on the tips here with the snake hook brush are basically all of the tips and the endings of these fur clumps getting defined. And yeah, so making this one stamp was basically my way of shortening the rest of the process for this fur. And I will probably also make an image tutorial of this approach of doing the fur, so that some of the smaller details about it are explained. And here I experimented with putting on the stamp in a couple of ways. And here I'm trying to figure out the directionality of the fur. So I start placing the stamp on the fur. Another thing that is not seen here so clearly, but that I also did, is that I'm doing this pass of the fur. I'm doing it on a layer. So a lot of these the clumps that I was doing of the fur on the underbelly previously, those are in a layer, and so here I was experimenting with the look of the stamp. And again, the stamp is also done in a layer, so that if I end up doing the fur and it's too strong and it has too much depth, I can always just regulate that with the layer opacity. And so yeah, again, I'll probably cover that in the image tutorial version of this as a companion. And so here I'm stamping the fur all over the body, and I'm always stamping it in the direction that I think the fur is flowing on that specific section of the animal. And I experimented with a few things on this also. I did try a couple of attempts with fiber mesh to try to get a version of fiber mesh that could be a base for a sculpted printable type of fur. But those experiments did not really work out for me. Maybe another artist that is more well versed with using fur would be able to do that better. But yeah, in my case, that didn't really pan out. And so yeah, the process in the video here seems to be repeated a couple of times, because I did try it out in one way with a layer, and then I had a look around it, and I decided, no, I'm not keeping this. But again, this is part of the benefit of having layers. And I think this is actually the final proper stamping pass of the fur. And at this point, I'm also masking all of the sections of fur that is hand sculpted, that has not been stamped. So this way, I'm not gonna disturb the fur that was hand sculpted, and I'll be able to stamp all over the body without fearing that I will overwrite the fur that I did by hand. Of course, I mask other sections like the nose and different parts of the body, but here this allows me now to get really close to the hand sculpted fur with my stamp, and cover the rest of the body without worrying too much. And if any transitions are not looking that brilliant on between the hand sculpted and the stamped fur, I'm gonna refine them later. So the stamp, of course, it's a solution that speeds up the process, but it's not the final look for the whole animal. It's a bit of a semi-final step for some of these parts. Once I'm done stamping, and the fur looks really strong on this pass that I'm using with the hand stamping. But again, I'm not worried that it looks too strong or that it's too much, because it's later gonna be toned down as the layer gets turned to a lesser opacity level. And so yeah, at this point I'm happy with the stamp and the look of it, because even though it's still looking very strong, I know that this is now the look that is going to be workable. That once I turn it down and refine it by hand in certain parts, I have it. I have the look that I'm after, that I'm satisfied with. And yeah, I mean, this look for fur might not be to the liking of everyone out there, but this was the one that I ended up kind of liking and feeling satisfied with after looking at a lot of toys and a lot of sculptures, both traditional and digital. And so yeah, and I'm using this stamp, of course, in different directions based on how I feel that the fur is going to be flowing. Some of the stamping goes a bit awry when I place it on certain angles. It causes a lot of stretched out lines. For example, here on the underside of these paws and of the legs. So here I'm stamping. Also, I'm masking the underside of the paws so that they don't end up getting that fur look to them on the parts where it shouldn't be. But yeah, basically this is the rest of the process. After this, it's not included in the video. I didn't manage to record that part, but it's very similar to the beginning. The refining process of this ends up consisting of toning down the opacity of the layer, and then hand refining some of the fur. Some of the fur gets pulled out a bit more, for example, with the snake hook brush, and some parts of it get smoothed and transitioned a bit better into the rest of the body. So, and at some point I start also using less intensity on the stamp, just to fill in some of the gaps and some of the areas that didn't have enough happening. Here I'm using a tiny version of the stamp on the nose and on the front part of the face. But yeah, just at this point I'm just closing a few of the gaps that are left, and there's very little left to the process. So yeah, again, masking those parts that shouldn't have the stamp. And the hand cleanup after this was not that heavy. I ended up on the underbelly. I worked on the fur a good bit more, but that is kind of similar to my other video of sculpting a cat. That one is sped up, but it's a very similar workflow. On the cat, I didn't use a stamp, which I guess it could have been a time saver for that one. But on that one, I was really trying to make even more stylized, longer fur than with this one. So with this one, I was trying to do something that was going to be very subtle. And in the final print of this, some of this fur is completely smooth, and it's almost not there. But the transitions between the normal coat of fur and the fluffier parts, they look pretty good on the final printed figure. So yeah, this is basically the end of the process video, and hope it was useful and interesting. Thanks.